This is a Raven Wright Studio video tutorial. The corresponding digital pattern and other digital patterns are available for sale at the website ravenwrightstudio.com. See the link in my YouTube profile. Welcome to Raven Wright Studio. My name is Ryan. This tutorial is part 2 of the Skipper Cap digital leather pattern. This is the Skipper Cap. It is a popular style of cap that has been around for generations. In part 1, I showed how to use the pattern to prepare the leather pieces. In this video, I will demonstrate the steps to assemble and sew the pattern. Let's get started. Written instructions for the assembly steps are included in the digital pattern. This is assembly step 1. Beginning with the hat body, we're going to fold it in half. The location of where to fold it in half is indicated on the paper pattern. And I'm going to use some of these stitch holders to hold it in place. You could use binder clips or even tape if you wanted to, but I like to use these stitch holders. They line up the holes very closely. So when we fold it in half, where the fold is will become the bottom edge of the hat. So once I've got it all pinned, see I folded the paper pattern to indicate what it will look like. And now I've got it all pinned in place. I am going to use just some thread, and this is not matching thread. I'm doing this. You can use any color thread, it doesn't matter, but I'm using white thread to show the stitches. I'm going to do something that's called based stitches. And that just means you're stitching something to hold it in place temporarily. And so I'm not going to stitch every stitch hole, although you could. You could stitch every stitch hole. I went about every 3 stitch holes or so to save time. And also make it easier to remove these threads when the next step is complete. So the purpose here is to hold this crease in place very securely at the next step. And these stitches don't have to be beautiful, but they're just a standard saddle stitch every 3 to 4 holes. And now that that's complete, depending on the type of leather you have, you may need to use a tool to improve that crease, to make it crease down really well. This is pretty soft, but I'm going to demonstrate with a bone folder how this can be done. This tool, called a bone folder, is probably mostly plastic these days, but originally made out of bone, and designed to help you put a crease in leather once you've folded it. So with the stitch holders on the top and the basting stitching on the bottom, that crease is securely in place. And we're just going to crease that leather so it makes it a good, nice crease. And I'm just going to turn it over and do it on the opposite side as well. The next step is to glue. So we remove the stitch holders, but we leave the basting stitches in place. And by adding glue, we're going to adhere the 2 sides of the piece together, as well as add a little bit of stiffness. This part of the hat, we want to be a little stiffer. It's the band that essentially goes around your head. And so it can be a little stiffer. It doesn't need to be very stiff, but the glue can help add some stiffness. and it holds the two pieces together. I'm just using some water-based leather glue, applying it with a small brush. And it's important to make sure all the holes line up. There will be holes on each side, and you want those holes to line up because eventually we're going to sew through them. And so if they're not lined up, that could be a problem. And if you get glue in the holes, it's not the end of the world. You can get your awl out and clear the hole with from the glue. I'm going to use my rolling pin again to roll it out, make sure that it's very snugly adhered. And I'm going through and just checking that the holes are aligned and sliding the piece back and forth a little bit here and there to make sure the holes are nicely aligned. Okay, assembly step 2. We're going to attach the visor and the visor stiffener at holes A and B. And so the bottom flips over and the top sews on the top. And starting at hole A, it will be hole A on both pieces. And we're going to sew this outside edge of the visor, bending it over and sandwiching the visor stiffener inside. And this will be a basic saddle stitch. I'm starting with a double stitch at the beginning, just to give it some extra strength. And so make sure that that top visor piece rolls over the visor stiffener to create an edge. And the visor stiffener becomes the meat of the sandwich on the inside. Now we saddle stitch all along the front edge. Okay, we've stitched all the way along, and now we've got just a few final stitches here at the end. And I'll demonstrate how to finish a stitch line. And I'm being very careful to align the needles just right so I don't catch the threads. And make sure I get all the holes because we're going through 3 different layers here in this last stitch. And then I'm going to back stitch 3 stitches, and that will lock the stitch line in place. So you finish, and then you turn around and go backwards 3 stitches. And often where I can put both needles through the hole at the same time when you're back stitching, usually can't do that because there's already a thread in the hole. And there are several ways to complete the stitch. This is one way to use some scissors and a lighter. And you cut it off so there's a little tail poking out, and you melt it down with the lighter. And I'm just using the base of the lighter to smash it flat. Do that on both sides. And if you've done that on both sides, that creates kind of an eye or shape between the hole, and it squishes those ends of the thread on both sides of that hole, locking that whole stitch in place. And now I'm going to use a planishing hammer, and this hammer is designed to just flatten the stitches. So I'm flattening the stitches and maybe improving the crease on a little bit. This isn't necessary, but it can clean up a stitch line and make it look a little bit cleaner if you've had any problems. Okay, the next step is to use some glue. I find it really convenient to put it in these squirt bottles. It comes in a tin, and I just pour it into these squirt bottles, kind of like adding your mustard and mayonnaise to your hot dog. And I'm going to use the brush to coat both sides of the inside of the visor. And this will glue the stiffener to the visor, and will also add some additional stiffness. You want the visor fairly stiff. And we're using quite a soft leather in general, so using the stiffening the visor is important. And we want to make sure to line up the holes. Once again, there's 3 layers of holes, and we need to get them lined up. And so I'm going to use these stitch holders. They're a little pin, and they have a back. If you've ever worn a basic earring, it might be very similar. And that just helps hold the stitches in the correct location while the glue dries. And that way, when it comes time to sew this to the corresponding piece, the holes will be all lined up. And as I mentioned before, if you get glue in the holes, it's not the end of the world. You get your awl, and you can, or a needle, and you can kind of poke the glue out of the holes once it's dried. Assembly step 4. I call these the vertical top of the hat. These 2 pieces will be sewn together. And there's an indication on the pattern on where the stitch line starts. This stitch line will be the center of what is called a French seam, and so it will be hidden. You could use a matching color of thread of the leather so that it's essentially invisible. And I'm using the same saddle stitch techniques as I've used previously. Once the stitch line is complete, backstitch, and this time I'm using a thread burner. It's a handy tool. It has a hot end, a hot tip, and it does the same thing. It burns off the thread and heats up the little tail so that it can be melted and smashed flat into the hole. Okay, that's complete. Assembly step 5. Now we're going to sew down the French seams. So the center seams are sewn, and now we're going to sew down the flaps, and there'll be a stitch line on either side of the center line. And I'm using this complementary thread that will be fairly visible once it's completed. Standard saddle stitch technique. So you sew one side down of the seam allowance, and then when that is complete, you sew the next side down of the seam allowance, and you do it on both portions of the hat of these two pieces. So there will be 4 stitch lines, two on each side, corresponding to this French seam. And that's what it looks like. And I didn't bother showing it on camera again for the next 3, but they're identical in the way you sew them down, and that's what they'll look like once it's complete. Assembly step 6. Now we're taking the top of the hat, which is perfectly round, and we're sewing it to the vertical top, the 2 pieces that we just sewed together. And it's important to fold over the stitch line. There's 2 stitch lines right at the top, and you fold that in half. And the needle goes through at both sides at once. And then take the top surface of the hat, of the top, and you go through that. So we're sewing through 3 layers, and we're making a seam that's visible on the inside and on the outside. Notice how the top edge of the vertical top portion, that I call it, is folded down and over. And that's important because it creates a little bit of structure in this very flexible leather. If we just sewed it together, there wouldn't be quite enough stiffness at the edge of the top. It would be really floppy. And this creates just a little bit of structure by making it 3 layers that we sew through. So I've sped up my sewing here, but take your time. It isn't a race. You want to do it correctly rather than do it twice. And with this type of leather that's soft and flexible, you don't want to pull too hard on the stitches. You want it to be snug, but if you pull too hard, you can get a pucker in the stitching. We don't want that. That's not part of this design. So I've got a couple stitches in, and I'm going to demonstrate a few more. You kind of have to flip back and forth to get the needles in on each side. Okay, this is what it looks like when it's all completed. You can see the stitch line on the outside right there and on the inside right there. Assembly step 7. Now that the glue has dried on the hat body, we can return to it. And we're going to remove the basting stitches. I'm using my awl here to get it started. I did a back stitch initially, so I need to kind of carefully pick that out. And you could also use a seam ripper to cut the stitches if you wanted. I'm just picking them out. And now that I've got it started, I've switched to a little plastic puller so that it's much less likely to damage the leather. And I'm just pulling each stitch out. Okay, once that's complete, we're going to sew the two ends together. This is just like when we sewed the vertical portion. We're going to sew this center seam, and then we sew down the French seams. So I'm just back stitching, finishing off with the thread burner. Assembly step 8. This is sewing down the French seams, and this is the identical technique that we used previously. There isn't a lot of stress on these particular stitch lines. The stress will be on the center stitch. These are just cosmetic, so it's not as important to backstitch full 3 stitches. You can do 1 or 2 stitches. You don't need to do a double stitch on the first stitch for extra strength. This just holds down the seam allowance on the inside. So that's one side completed, and that's what it looks like. And now both sides of the French seam completed. Both seam allowances are sewn down. Assembly step 9. We're going to sew the top portion of the hat to the body of the hat. And there is where I put a piece of thread through the hole where the pattern indicates to sew those two together. It's indicated on the pattern where those two portions of the pattern should be sewn together, and I just marked them with a piece of thread to make it easy. And I turned the top portion of the hat inside out for ease of sewing. because what happens is the outside portion of the hat, of the top, faces the outside portion of the bottom of the hat, and it creates a seam line inside that's hidden. It's a hidden seam line that will be inside the hat once it's turned correct side out. So I'm going to demonstrate how I'm doing it there. This is, once again, the standard saddle stitch. And the sewing will continue all the way around the hat till you get back to where you started. Okay, we've got about half of the stitch line completed. You can see it's invisible from the correct side out. And you can see the stitch line, both sides. Now we're just finishing the stitch line. The last couple of stitches. Then we back stitch a couple of stitches. Cut and burn the thread with the thread burner. Now we can turn the hat right side out. Assembly step 10. This is the binding sweatband. So it performs a function of a binding on the bottom edge of the hat, as well as folding over to be a sweatband on the inside. And we're just going to overlap the perpendicular stitch line and sew it together. So this is different than the other pieces we joined together, where we sewed a center line and then sewed down French seams. We're overlapping this stitch line and sewing it down. We are not doing anything with a seam allowance on this particular place. Standard saddle stitch technique, backstitch, burn the threads. Assembly step 11. So what I'm demonstrating is that there is a location on the pattern of where the holes A and B and center holes for the visor and the sweatband binding start. And so I've marked those with pieces of thread. And there's also, it's indicated on the pattern where those holes A and B are as well. On the sweatband binding, I've marked those with pieces of thread so that we can line those up. And so we're going to sew between holes B and A the long way. There's two directions. There's a longer way and a shorter way. And the shorter way, we'll sew the visor into it. But right now we're going to do the longer way. We're going to fold over the binding sweatband over the edge of the hat body and sandwich it inside. So once again, we're sewing through 3 layers, and the sweatband binding will be on the outside of each layer. And you can start at hole B or A, it doesn't really matter, as long as you sew the long way around. And you can see the bottom edge of the hat body is getting sewn in between that. And now we've sewn it all the way around. That's the back side of the hat. You can see where the seam is. It should line up directly with the seam on the other part of the hat. And we're going to keep finishing. So when we get to the hole on the other end, we'll backstitch a couple of holes. And either cut and burn with a lighter or use a thread burner if you've got one. We finished that portion of the stitch line. Now, assembly step 12, we're going to sew the brim onto the hat. And so this is slightly more complicated. We're going to sew the brim will be on the outside, and then the next layer will be the first layer of the binding through the body of the hat, through to the sweatband side. So there's several layers we're sewing through, but they should line up neatly. If you haven't visited part 1, you should probably visit part 1 before you do this and see how I finished the raw edge of the visor. So I did a double stitch to get started for some extra strength. And then we're going to continue to sew through 4 layers. But it shouldn't be terribly challenging. They're all pretty thin, and they should line up nicely. But take your time lining it up and double checking that you've got each stitch through each hole that corresponds correctly. Okay, so you sew that all the way through, and it's the same as before. We're going to finish the last couple of holes, back stitch, so sewing the visor on could be the most challenging sewing portion of this pattern, just because of how many layers you're sewing through. But I think it makes a really nice, polished, finished hat. And you have the comfort of the sweatband all the way around. And once that's complete, go ahead and burn off the tails. We have now completed the last step on the skipper cap, and we have finished.